It's a great pleasure for me to have today with us my good friend and collaborator in many things, Ajay Shah, who's one of India's finest economists. Thanks a lot for joining us and doing this edition of Tune In with us.
Good to be here with you. Thank you.
You've been studying Indian firms for over 30 years, and you've got a whole range of interesting insights into what makes a firm in India a success. And the reason that you believe in this is because you feel very strongly that the main driver of growth for the Indian economy needs to be private business. So do start us off with what big economic theories that you subscribe to guide that belief.
The heart and soul of productivity and prosperity in a market economy is this construct called the firm. Firms aggregate a large amount of capital and labor and create output per worker, which is superior to what we might have been able to achieve one person at a time. We create high productivity because there is an organization. So these firms are the backbone of the journey to high productivity. So a prosperous country is a high productivity country, and high productivity is made in firms that know how to mobilize capital and labor to achieve high levels of productivity.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, that's something that we certainly see in our practice. But if you look at the period through which you've been studying the Indian firm, there are a few different phases in that journey. One is the pre-92 phase, when firms had to navigate their way through the license Raj. Then post-92, when we saw the rise of a whole range of new businesses in areas of the economy that were unshackled from regulatory constraints. And perhaps a new phase, the one that we are currently in, which is seeing the more rapid growth of Indian firms and the emergence of many large companies and unicorns. How can we try and understand the difference between these three phases, and what explains the phase that we are currently in?
One is the role of foreign competition. In the old India, in many industries, you were corseted and protected. Today, in many industries, you're facing competition either from goods and services that are directly imported from abroad or from global firms operating in India. And that's a sea change. And it's a wonderful level of pressure for Indian firms to have to face foreign competition. You have to up your game. The second important transformation is surrounding the nature of the firm around family businesses and dispersed shareholding. In the old days, generally, the top firms of India were all controlled by a family. Some exceptions like ITC and L&T apart, you generally had family businesses. There is a new rise of many important firms who are not simple family businesses. And we can see why that's happening. There are the venture capital and private equity firms who are building businesses in a very different way compared to the good old days, where by the time you get to year 10 and an IPO, the founding team is down to 10-20% of shareholding. So there's no question of a family having dominant control. And so this is a very different creature. It's a dispersed shareholding firm. Further, then we've had the normal evolution of families where across generations, family coherence breaks down, inheritance fragments, ownership across many children. Some children are not so keen on running the business actively. So that also tends to convert a well-coordinated empire into many separate pieces that are going off in their own direction. And finally, we've had important events because of the IBC. The bankruptcy reform has created situations where you've got a very different architecture of the ownership and the governance of the firm. So I think this is a big change that has come about. And I want to just parenthetically say that sometimes there is a value judgment attached to this in India, where some people feel that somehow family firms are a bad thing and that so-called professional firms are better. And I don't think like that. I think both kinds of firms are interesting, complex, and challenging. And it is very difficult to get the incentives right. So I don't think of these as either or, and I don't think of one as a panacea. I do think in terms of a bit of an inevitability that in the long term, more and more firms will end up being dispersed shareholding. And so I actually think of this as a difficult journey of the next 20 years. And, you and I and many of us need to absorb ourselves into that challenge to think about the culture, the rhythm, the institutions, the laws, the way in which managers will work, the way in which boards will work, so as to conquer this beast.
Let's dig a little deeper into one of the themes that you addressed a couple of times in what you just said, which is the idea of firm structure. I mean, the shareholding structure, of course, is one part of it, but there's a very important role, and sometimes a minimized, disregarded role of the board, of a modern firm. And so, what is it that you've seen in the last 20, 30 years of the nature of boards, and what sort of boards succeed or help their companies to succeed versus boards that perhaps make life easier for the promoters but don't add much value to the company itself?
When the promoter has 51%, the board plays two roles. One, they are advisors to the manager and the promoter. They bring specialized, distinctive knowledge and strategic sense to the board. And in addition, the independent board members need to protect the interests of minority shareholders. In a dispersed shareholding company, there is no promoter. There are managers. They don't have the active supervision of Mr. 51%. The myth of the strong leader, the myth of the great leader, the myth of the CEO is a very primitive theory about the success and failure of organizations. It is important for the board to question the nature of power in these organizations and to create the questions, the discussions, and the debate through which it will not be a case of unchecked power. There is a lot of noise that gets made in India about execution against strategy. I think this is a dangerous ethos that is emerging, but it is the job of board members to be stepping into the shoes of the long time horizons of equity shareholders, to demand strategic thinking and to handle the conflict between short-term and long-term. And we in India are only beginning to understand and develop that ethos of what is a board and what is the role of the board. So this is the way I feel we should be thinking about these problems.
Well, there's a lot to think about there and a lot to do, obviously, as a consequence of that. But let me move to a point that you made earlier and try and link it to what you just said, and then take it in a certain direction, which is, you talked about one of the benefits of liberalization was the fact that Indian firms now had the need to start competing with international businesses and were exposed to the international economy. Can we just sort of dig a little deeper into that, and can we also speculate at the fact that to see whether the increasing amount of FDI in India will bring with us some of those board level practices that we may not have had in the past?
As India opened up and imports came and FDI came, they created a brutal and new level of competition in many markets. And it has worked exactly as wonderfully as all of us hoped. So the capabilities of a good Indian company today are out of the world. In so many industries, Indian firms have held their ground, have competed against the best of the global firms, and come out looking very good. And the only qualification is that there is way more protectionism in India than we would like. So in many, many industries, the process of opening up has really not been done as much as I would like.
But let's get back to the broader effect of opening up to the outside world. And why should an Indian company who's got a great domestic business bother about going international at all?
Economics has one important insight to offer here. And first, let me say it as a headline, and then let me dive a little into this. Good firms do exports and the best firms do FDI. Okay, so there's a clear sorting that you take any industry, you sort the firms by FDI, exports, domestic. And you see a pattern that amongst these firms in the country, the weakest firms are purely domestic. The better firms have ventured abroad as exports, and the best firms have done FDI abroad. Why is that? Imagine hypothetically I'm making ball bearings in India, and now we are in a decision that do I want to embark on selling ball bearings in Germany, in Japan? These are vast manufacturing economies. They are great markets for high precision, high quality, high profit ball bearings. Now, there'll be a fixed cost to exporting, and there'll be the cost of transportation. So for me to pay the cost of transportation and compete against a local German firm and still turn a profit will be very hard. And you will only take that jump if you're a really strong firm. The weak firms will look at the cost of transportation, at the complexity of establishing a German operation and they'll say, look, just let it be. I'll stick to my Indian market. Only the better firms will go. But then comes part two. Once the better firms make that jump, now you've got German customers breathing down your neck. They are demanding higher technology. They're demanding better tolerances. They're demanding new kinds of engineering that you have not even heard about. So the exporting then fuels the productivity gain of the firm. Okay, so this is the first part of the story, that better firms export. Part two, the best firms do FDI. Now let's play this to the next higher limit. That I'm asking you to commit lots of money, $10 million, $50 million, $100 million to establish operations in Germany and make high precision ball bearings in Germany competing with German companies. Again, the same stories apply. It's a different level of confidence, competence, and capability. It takes a lot of confidence to do the FDI. And then after that, the FDI turns around and feeds you back. Because now you're competing in Germany. You've got the practices in Germany. And you keep thinking intelligently and innovatively. And suddenly you're on an outward spiral. So for all these reasons, I think there is value in this simple one-liner that good firms export, the best firms do FDI. And I will always advocate in an Indian setting that if you are a firm, fight the export market because it will kick you and it will make you better. And if you are a shareholder or a board member, then just put crazy demands about export and FDI on your managers. They'll say this is very hard. But you know what? That's how we'll get performance.
We've seen this sort of evolution in many of our clients, and a lot of them now have traveled the path that you mentioned. And I think we can probably safely say that adage does work. So, at least in our own experience. But let's look a little more specifically at the sectors now. What are the sectors that you see today and in the next 5 and 10 years that Indian companies, Indian firms should be looking at as far as competitive advantage is concerned?
I've been asked this question all my life, and I used to always give the boring, convoluted answer. Here is the boring, convoluted answer. India is a highly diverse economy. India has an unusually diversified portfolio of what is successfully made and exported out of India. There are many, many capabilities here. So you should try all kinds of things. You never know what's going to work. In the last 10 years, there is, however, a rather simple story about what is working. There is a single sector that has come to shine. And that sector is IT and IT-enabled services. And when I say IT-enabled services, I do include all the complex knowledge work, the consulting work, the legal processing work, the things that could have never been done out of India without the presence of modern IT, where the IT just happens to be the vehicle through which an organization in India, a team in India, is a first-class participant in a production process led out of London and New York. But for today, I just want to call it IT-enabled services, because without the IT, this team in India would have been cut off. When you take the 10-year track record of exports growth out of India from, I think, 2012 to 2022, that's 10 years, the real USD exports, compound exports growth of goods was about 1.5%, which is nothing. Whereas in IT-enabled services, other business services, that growth was 9% in constant dollars. So that's spectacular. You're getting 9% real growth. So this is fact one. And fact two that I want to bring to the table here is that if you go dig inside the firm data, the CMIE database of about 55,000 firms, out of which 25,000 are non-financial firms, you find a simple pattern that the biggest industry in India today is IT and IT-enabled services. So I feel this is the first time, only in the last few years, I have abandoned my earlier claims that India is a very diversified economy. Today, the game is to take high-skilled people in India and connect them up into the global market using IT.
That just brings me to my last question, which is on the role of the state itself. What is the role of the state today in supporting businesses? I mean, we've seen in the last few years, not just in India, but all over the world, that governments are stepping in with policies to support the growth of domestic businesses. Even the US is seeing this at the moment. And in India, we have our much vaunted production-linked incentive scheme. What can and should state governments really be doing to help their businesses?
The state is important above all on the basics of rule of law, of the foundations of taxation, capital controls, financial regulation, labor law, pollution. This is the core business of the state. And if the state does this well, the private sector will do the rest. And if the state does not do this well, it will disrupt the working of the private sector. So I feel we should always focus on public goods. The job of the state is around those basics. Adam Smith has a great paragraph where he says something like, growth is the natural thing, that if there is a tolerable level of justice, then the private sector will do the rest of the magic. So the line to think about is, when the water crosses here and you no longer have a tolerable level of justice, then the private sector gets disheartened and then you get a collapse of private sector investment. So I feel that's the way to think about it, that the state is primarily about rule of law. It's about fair play. It's about creating conditions where the private sector will build and run the economy.
Well, Ajay, thanks a lot. That was a fun discussion to have, and lots of interesting insights there. And I'm sure our clients will be delighted to hear from you in this format. Thanks a lot.
Good to be here with you. Thank you.